the great thing about it. It's endlessly exciting because there's so much new stuff. Whereas stereo is still awesome and the song is new every time, but it's not that same kind of discovery of the technique.
How faithful do you stay to the original stereo mix?
Normally pretty faithful, because in headphones it can't sound alien, especially if it's an older project. People know what it should be and it needs to feel exactly the same. But it can't sound exactly the same, otherwise what's the point? So it's finding a way to be really creative, and so it's really compelling if someone gets into a good room, but it'll work in a bad room and it'll work in headphones. Just like when you mix in stereo, it has to work on every pair of speakers, right? It needs to work on your laptop, on your phone, and on something like this. It's the same with Atmos, but it's more about the quality of the playback system in terms of how many speakers do they have, how's it being decoded, is one speaker in the kitchen? Like there's so many more variables that I feel like you need to make sure that it will work in the lowest common denominator, but that lowest common denominator can be really weird compared to what the original mix is, not just it's a different speaker. So there's a lot to do, and what that usually means is that in headphones you are not going to notice a gigantic difference if you know the record and then you hear my Atmos mixes, but if you flip back and forth, it just collapses when you listen in stereo, and that's when I know I've done a good job. The people don't know unless they A/B it, and if they do, and they happen to like the way immersive stuff works, it's like, oh my god, I love this, I'm living inside the record instead of listening to the record.
How do you deal with I guess especially with a lot of rock music, most of us, use stereo bus compression and stereo EQ on a master bus. You can't really do that in Atmos. So how do you maintain the tone? The overall sound or vibe of a classic rock mix?
Yeah, I mean, there are ways you can cheat the bus thing, but it's a technical rabbit hole and it doesn't really matter. The way I do it when it's stuff that I've mixed is my stems are through my mix bus. Because if you say like, okay, everybody's going through the mix bus, and so when the compressor goes, everybody gets turned down. So if you bounce one thing at a time, well, that's not going to be the same. And yes, technically it's not going to be the same, but who cares? Because what's happening is you're changing the character of the really loud stuff, which is probably the drums or the vocal. And it's still going to do that because it's still going to be really loud even when it's soloed. And the other stuff, do you really want all your keyboards to go with a kick and snare, but they might be panned in the back, and now they're just like changing level and it's distracting? You don't. And also, there's no reason for these stems to be exactly the same as the stereo, because you have the stereo and now you're making something different. So I've found that bouncing the stems that way, even though I've got every single instrument separate, it still adds up to the mix, and the character of the compression, if it's on the mix bus, is imparted to the individual stuff. So I don't know if that really makes sense, but everything that needs it gets it, and it turns out the other stuff doesn't need it.
So you're pre-rendering your stems through your mix bus?
Yeah.
You're not running it live on all of the...
No, even when I'm doing the stereo mix, the workflow is almost always that the stereo mix gets approved, the entire record gets mastered, and then there's a panicked phone call that they have decided they actually do want Atmos. So there are two reasons I do the stems the way I do. One, I want absolutely everything separate, so I'm mixing from a multi-track, but I don't have to keep track of things like bus compression, because that is what could get destroyed when you do stuff and start pulling it apart. So that's baked in. The other reason is because labels lose stuff. Or you're trying to open up a 10-year-old Pro Tools session and there are plugins that don't exist anymore, or things like that. So I'm basically making a new multi-track, which you can push up the faders, and it's like every record made in the 60s where you pushed up the tracks and that's the record. So it's that idea of it's also archival, which now mixers are expected to take care of. It used to be you delivered stuff to the labels, they took care of it, it went into vaults. Then it turns out that sometimes the vaults catch on fire and they don't actually have 2 copies of it, or stuff gets lost. So now the mixers usually are expected, when they get a phone call or an email 10 years later, because there might be an ad, to be able to crank out an instrumental mix that they've lost in, within a day. So for me, it's really important to actually archive, and then the stuff is really useful as well. There's a very long answer. I apologize.
Have you messed with any of the immersive plugins, the reverbs and?
Yep. I think some of them are great. The Eventide immersive stuff is really, really great. They only 2 plugins, but one of them is Black Hole, which is a really characterful reverb, which is awesome. And then they've got their micro pitch, and a lot of people use micro pitch slap, so a tiny bit of pitch shifting and a little bit of slap delay to sort of spread vocals. And their immersive version of it does that spreading thing without you really noticing. It's like the Atmos to stereo thing I was talking about before, but you don't feel like there's a ton of effect on the thing you're using it unless you really want to crank it. But when you take it off, it all just collapses. It sounds crazy dry. So in a way, what's great about it is how subtle it is, and that it doesn't raise its hand and say, hey, I'm in Atmos.
Do you find yourself with new mixes, like not catalog stuff, but things that you're doing now where you're going to be doing the stereo and you know you're going to be doing the Atmos mix, do you stick with, like, would you start with the Black Hole in stereo knowing that I'm then going to use this on my Atmos mix, or?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, because if you only add it later, now the amount of effect on something when it crashes down to stereo and you're listening in the headphones, now it's too wet. It's got too much stuff. So it's a little difficult, but I would never compromise something in the stereo mix so that it will work better in the Atmos mix. So generally the effects will be similar, and then if I know I'm going to use something like Black Hole, for instance, I would use a stereo version in the stereo mix, but my stem would be dry. I'll print the stereo Black Hole so it exists on its own track, and then I will replace it with the surround version of Black Hole, because I get the space out of it for free, but I know it will also sound, it's not going to mess up the mix. It'll still do what it's supposed to do in the stereo version of the immersive mix.
What do you do in an Atmos mix, like on a catalog track, maybe where the reverb is printed and all you've got is a stereo reverb? Do you marry it to the source, or do you move it around?
It depends. I do a lot of really weird stuff. This is the kind of rabbit hole learning thing I was talking about, where there are lots of upmixing plugins. It'll take stereo, and based on how decorrelated the signal is, it puts some stuff in the front, some stuff in the back, some stuff up top. And then I've just got presets of those that are really weird and shouldn't happen. So what I'll do, if I get a vocal that has effects printed on it, I'll leave that alone, and that will be what's in the front. But then I put that through one of these demixing plugins, and I turn off everything except the rear speakers and the height, because that's where all the weirdest decorrelated stuff is going to be, and it just extends the effect back into the room, but it still sounds exactly like the effect. So I don't try and remake it, because sometimes these are like crazy chains of 5 or 6 different effects, and I don't even know what they are. So yeah, there are a lot of little things that you kind of have a toolbox for that would never even come up in stereo.
I know 10 years ago, if you would have been at an NAMM show and talked about mixing, and somebody said, do you mix in headphones? Everybody go, you can't mix in headphones. And now everybody seems to be mixing in headphones, especially because of the binaural stuff. How much time do you spend mixing in headphones or checking binaural?
A huge amount of time in headphones for the last 15 years at least. Every single Atmos mix I do, every single mix I do, doesn't matter whether it's stereo or Atmos, starts in headphones. It's just a way I've gotten used to doing it, because also when I'm traveling, I can start in on mixes until I get home and can check them on the speakers and things like that. So I've gotten really used to it, and especially with the Atmos mixes, you can get quite a bit done in headphones. If you've been doing it a lot, I think you might even be able to finish the mix in headphones. If you haven't, you've got to get on speakers. You have to. But the more you do it, the closer you're going to be on headphones, and it'll just be like, oh, hold on a second, I've separated this way too much. Because when it's in headphones, you feel like, oh, it's only this far apart, and then it turns out it's like that. But that way, you don't do all this stuff on speakers that you think is amazing, and then you first listen to the binaural, and it's horrible. And what are you going to do? I mean, obviously the speaker version is the master, but 99.something% of people in the world will never hear it anywhere except on headphones, so that has to work. So I find this way that there are very few times where I have to start anything over. It's a tweak, and then I come back to headphones just to double check.
What are the biggest differences that you find yourself having to, and how do you balance the headphone binaural with the real world?
Well, basically,
where's the compromise, I guess?
Yeah, I end up at the point where there actually aren't compromises. What will happen is sometimes in headphones, I'll pan stuff, and obviously I'm not really panning it front to back. It's just changing the binaural processing on it. And I think that's going to be cool, because I'm also imagining what it's going to be like in speakers, and then I listen to it in speakers, and like I was saying just now, I've separated two instruments that need to go together like way too much, so I've got to get those two things panned closer together in some way. So that's one thing that definitely happens. But then when you go back to headphones, that's going to be fine. Who cares? They're just closer. And the other thing is as you pan from the very front and you start to come around the sides, the level can get weird. Like, it can come up in level in headphones, but not in the speakers. But, you know, we're talking a couple of dB, so if you do compromise 1 dB either way, or just pan it somewhere else, you're fine. It's absolutely fine. And then the other thing is center channel, which we won't go down the rabbit hole of, but in stereo there is no center channel. The stuff that is in the center is coming out of two speakers, so it's a phantom center, it's phasey, it's weird, but we're really, really used to it. So when you hear something out of one speaker that's in front of you for the first time, it sounds crazy. Vocals through one speaker in front of you sounds totally different than vocal out of two speakers that are in front of you. So managing that between speakers and headphones can be tricky.
So I have noticed that there is, in the binaural renderer, you can pick like
distances, yeah.
Do you recommend screwing with that, or do you?
Oh God, yeah.
Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, if you've got a song and there's a keyboard pad, like a guitar song, but there's a keyboard pad in the chorus or whatever, and you decide that's going to go in the back, and that works great. In headphones, if you put it on far, now it has way more processing, so it's going to change the sound of it more, but who cares? It's the keyboard pad and the guitars are doing the thing. But for people who really externalize and it sounds like stuff is coming from behind them, it's really behind them, instead of being this weird somewhere inside your head thing. Like, headphones are weird. All the sound is coming from inside your head. That's not natural at all. And when it works, those distance settings, it's not near, mid, and far. It's just like how much processing is there. But when it works, it really does make it immersive. It's like you're inside of it instead of it being in your head. So yeah, I highly recommend messing around with those settings.
When you are mixing for people, whether it's a stereo mix or an Atmos mix, obviously the level of clients you're working with, one would assume that they're sending you really solid, well-labeled
sometimes
tracks.
It's all over the place.
What's a happy day for you like? What's the perfect, do you want
the delivery?
Do you want the effects printed? Do you want them to be like, oh, I left the plugin on the Pro Tools set? I mean,
I'm okay with people leaving plugins, because at this point I own almost every single plugin, because people send me something to mix, there's a plugin I don't own, I get the demo of it. If it's really cool, I buy it, and if it isn't, well, then I don't need it, it's fine. My favorite thing to get is the Pro Tools session, assuming they're working in Pro Tools, that made the rough mix that everyone's listening to. I want to start from there, but I don't want everything baked in, because I can back out of what was going on. But to have to recreate stuff that people have been listening to for 3 months is insane. But if you ever get a comment that something should be more like the rough mix, unless you've changed it, you need to tell them, well, then send it to me like that, because that's not something I've done, and I can't mix through other people's ears. And it's not as simple as like, oh, you've EQ'd it different. It's always how it feels. So it's a combination of 500 things. So I'd love to get the Pro Tools session that I can just open it up, hit play, that is the rough mix, and I can work from there.
So when you start, do you have templates? Do you, like, if you're say you get everything dry, nothing...
I have a template. I think templates are a great way to work. They save you time and they keep you creative, because you're not trying to rebuild building block stuff of mixing. So the first thing I do is color code everything, get the tracks in the order that makes sense to me. So every single session I've ever mixed has the same colors on the drums. The drums are at the top, the kick drum is at the top of the drums, blah, blah, blah. That way I can open up something from 10 years ago and I can find stuff immediately. Then I import everything from my template, which is basically just bussing and some reverbs and some delays and some parallel compressors, just the stuff that you would leave patched in if you're mixing a record in a studio. And then I can start assigning stuff to go through parts of my template. But at the very beginning, nothing is going through my template. It's their session with all my stuff in it, and then I will just start to bring bits of my template in as I assign stuff.
Very, very cool. What's your favorite drum color?
Oh no, there's no such thing as a favorite drum color. It's what is the proper drum color. It's a very dark blue. The reason these colors exist is because when I mixed on a console, I bought some Sharpies, and the Sharpies had specific colors, and so those are the colors that tracks have to be in Pro Tools. So drums are a very dark blue, bass is a slightly lighter blue, guitars are green, different shades of green depending on how distorted they are if I'm really spending time coloring things. Keyboards are anywhere from a dark red through the purples depending on how organic they are. Like a piano is probably more like a dark red. Lead vocals are obviously orange, and background vocals are two different shades of like mustardy yellow stuff, and there's a bright yellow VCA in between every group of instruments, so I can scroll through a gigantic session and know immediately those are the background vocals. And I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it saves me. Not only does it save me time, what it saves me is being distracted. The worst thing in the world is to be working on a mix and you hear something and you're like, oh man, there's something going on the piano there, I need to sort that out, and you can't find the piano. Because by the time you find it, you've forgotten why you're doing it. You know you're looking for the piano, you kind of remember there was something in the low mids, but you're not even sure where in the song it was now, and it's gone. And all the good work happens when you're not thinking at all. It's the creative thing that songwriters get into, and mixers get into it too. And if you're distracted, you're screwed, and it can take 45 minutes to get back into it. So all of the stuff I do that seems unbelievably anal and weird is so that I never lose the flow when I'm in it. And when I come out of it, it's because I'm not being creative and I just go and do something else or work on a different song. Not, I couldn't find the kick drum and now I forgot what I'm doing.
On average, how long does it take you to, I know you've been asked this before, but
yeah,
how long does it take you to mix a song? But now I would say, how long does it take you to mix a song in stereo? And maybe how long does it take to mix it in Atmos?
I have absolutely no idea. It's really, I have no idea, because the way I'll work on I hate working on one song at a time. Because the thing you need most as a mixer is perspective. You need to come hear it fresh as a listener, not as the mixer who just spent an hour and a half working on something. It's all you can hear is the thing you've been working on. So if I'm working on a record, I will open up the songs alphabetically. And I work on one song until I don't really know what to do next. Close it, move on to the next one. Close it. So sometimes I'll work on all 12 songs of the 12-song record twice in one day. Sometimes I'm sitting on one song for 5 hours because I'm getting there, or I'm not getting anywhere and I refuse to be defeated. Sometimes I'm not getting anywhere and realize, or I know what I have to do next and I really don't want to do it, and I'll close the session and move on to the next one. So there's some mixes where I come back to the song a second time and realize it's completely finished and I don't even remember doing it. And there are other times where I come back to a song that I think is done, I've done a ton of work on it, and I hit play and like, wow, this still sucks. And it's not right. So not only do I not know, but it doesn't even matter, really. And this is why when I take on a project, the only two questions I ask are, when can I get the files and when do you need it? Because all I want to know is, in my head, do I think I have enough time? Whether I'm working 20-hour days or 3-hour days or 7 days a week or 2 days, like, it doesn't matter, because I know I just need to have it done by a certain time, and then I get it done. I'm weird.
Do you ever... I remember asking Alan Parsons this once, about Dark Side of the Moon. I'm like, do you ever hear Dark Side of the Moon on the radio and think, damn it, I wish I would have mixed that snare drum differently. It's still bugging me 50 years later. Do you have any mixes where you're in
So did Alan say yes or no?
He actually said yes.
I'm sure he did, because famously he wasn't that happy about Chris Thomas coming in at the end. I think he really wanted to just finish that himself. There's a Classics Albums DVD about Dark Side of the Moon. Watch the bonus features, because they've edited some interviews together in really funny ways. Anyway, no, I mean, there isn't anything where it's like, oh, I wish that thing was different. There are things where I feel like I've failed the song. Like, I hear it later, and it's like, man, this could be so much better. Whether I did it again or whether somebody else did it, I feel like somehow the song didn't do the thing it was supposed to do. But then also, I'll hear stuff that I did 20 years ago, like, oh my God, who did that? Like, that's insane. There's no way I did that. So it goes both ways. But this whole, like, working in a trance thing, like, I'll come back to a song I'm actually working on and won't remember, like, I won't remember the fact that I've actually got the vocals in and there are vocal effects changes and stuff like that. So how could I possibly remember what I did 10 years ago? But yeah, it's sometimes it's really great to hear old stuff, and sometimes it is so depressing.
That's awesome. Final
now,
question.
I would change a lot of stuff on Dark Side of the Moon, though, by the way. No, I would not.
Final question. Is there anything that I haven't asked you, or that nobody's ever asked you? I wish somebody would ask me this.
No.
No?
You got another question?
I don't.
There's got to be something. I don't know.
Any final advice that you would have for people wanting to get into this crazy business of either starting somebody's never done Atmos. What would you recommend? Or
well, we had a lot of discussions, actually. So I'm on the Producers and Engineers Wing Steering Committee, which is a sort of arm of NARIS, which runs the Grammys. So a lot of producers and engineers are on that, and we talk about technical stuff and whatever. But so all of this talk about Atmos, and people were asking for guidelines for mixing in Atmos. Like, okay, should the bass be in the center speaker? Should the bass be sent to the LFE channel for the subwoofer? And all this stuff. And I railed against this very, very hard, because I think the worst thing in the world you can do is tell somebody they should do specific things when you haven't heard the song. Like, it might be amazing to have the bass in the back on one song. So what I suggested, and we're starting to put it together, which is good, is to listen, to just make playlists of Atmos mixes that we as a group say, this works. Not that we necessarily like it, but we think, like, musically this is amazing, so that you can just go and listen and hopefully learn. In the same way, if you're going to mix records in stereo, you better have listened to a ton of records, because that's where you learn stuff. And you also learn that it doesn't matter what the snare drum sounds like. What matters is how loud is it, and is it destroying the groove, or is it helping the groove, and that kind of thing. So listening is it. Find records that you love and try and figure out why you love them, and then try and make that happen again. But try and make the feeling happen. Don't worry about the sonics. A lot of people say to use reference tracks, and for me it just is confusing. There are tracks where I think the low end is amazing, but the difference between the level of the low end and the level of the vocal is going to be totally different than the mix I'm working on. So it just confuses me, because I'll want to check the low end and think, oh my God, my vocal is way too loud. And of course it's nothing to do with the vocal. So just listen, and then listen some more.
I find my favorite Atmos mixes that I've heard, especially of classic songs, are the ones where my brain says, that's the song. When I heard, one of my favorites was, if you've heard the Moon Dance that Steven Wilson did and you listen to that and you go, this is the same album that I've known my whole life, but instead of here, it's now here, but it's not here. It's not, exactly. Flying around and so you're listening to the song, not the mix.
I would like to say that Steven Wilson is probably one of the best Atmos mixers in the world, and he gets all of the good gigs, therefore I hate him. He's done the King Crimson and the Yes catalogs, which is like, I could retire if I got to, but he's so good that he has to be the one doing them.
This sounds like a dumb statement. He actually made me a Jethro Tull fan because of his remix. Not that I didn't like Jethro Tull, but their albums always sounded.
Some of them didn't sound so great.
And suddenly what he did with them, I'm like, these are amazing. I love this band.
They're an amazing band. And with Crimson, I think I don't think Robert Fripp was really convinced, and then he heard, and there's stuff I saw him. He posts. If you don't follow Robert Fripp on Facebook and you're a King Crimson fan, you have to follow him on Facebook. He is hilarious. Basically, people just ask questions, and he posts the question, and then he answers it. But sometimes he's like super cranky, and sometimes he's really, really funny, and it's amazing. And someone asked about one of the older King Crimson records, and he said, "Yeah, I never really liked the way that turned out, but Steven Wilson changed my mind. I think it's a great record."
I'm waiting for his Lizard. I'm hoping he does Lizard and Atmos.
Yeah.
When I heard his 5-1 mix, that album finally made sense to me.
Right.
For some reason, in stereo, it was okay, but...
Yeah, so if you like older music and you want to learn about how to do stuff in Atmos that was definitely not conceived for a surround format, all the Steven Wilson stuff is just stellar, just absolutely amazing and so musical. It's incredible.
What's your favorite Atmos mix that you've done? What would you steer people? What would you tell people? Listen to this.
All right, I would tell you that the Low Roar album that I just finished, it's coming out. It'll be out in 2 weeks. 2 of the singles are out, and the whole album will be out on February 7th. And it is. I just spent the hour just listening to Low Roar at PMC. I hate talking about my own work in any fashion whatsoever. It's amazing. It is so immersive. Like, you live inside the record for an hour. I can't quite believe that I did it. That's how good it is. Like, someone else did this. So please, Low Roar, A House in the Woods, coming to record streaming services near you.
Awesome. That's a perfect place to wrap this up. I appreciate this. This is some absolutely amazing information. So,
thanks, Paul. It was
really
fun.
Yep.
Thanks.
Andrew Shepps.